Good afternoon and welcome to the Edinburgh International Book Festival. My name's Nick Barley. Yes, I'm not Roy Hattersley. I'm the director of the festival, and it's my great honour to introduce today's session. There are not many participants in the book festival who can say that they have appeared at every single one of our festivals since we launched in 1983, but Roy Hattersley is one. He was MP, as you know, for Birmingham Spark Book from 1964 to 1997. Then he went into the Lords. He's now, of course, the Right Honourable Lord Hattersley. He was a Secretary of State in the Labour government throughout much of the 70s and a Shadow Secretary of State throughout much of the 80s. But above all, he's been a Labour man through and through thick and thin. But best of all, he's a fantastic raconteur. So who better to ask about what future the Labour Party may have than the wonderful Roy Hattersley. Please give a huge welcome, Roy Hattersley.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. As with the previous 30-odd times I've been here, I'm going to talk to you without notes. But this is here for me to lean on. Because the director feels he doesn't want to break new ground today by having the first fatality during his speech. Which is in some ways appropriate to talk about the Labour Party, but let's... I intended to talk to you, and I am going to talk to you, about the Labour Party's future, what we might be like in 5 or 6 years' time, how we develop in the new world. But it seems to me this morning it would be totally perverse not to say in these circumstances something about the Labour Party today as it stands this week now. And therefore I propose to do just that. Beginning with a confession to some of you, an admission to others, that the week after Jeremy Corbyn was elected leader of the Labour Party, I wrote a piece for The Guardian regretting that fact. I had many things that he had many attributes which I didn't share. He believed in things I didn't believe in. He had associations I wouldn't have. But the reason, the basic reason, the fundamental reason that I was opposed to his election as leader was I did not believe that the Labour Party could win an election under his leadership. And it seems to me that the Labour Party has a moral duty to win elections. It's not a game, it's not some adolescent preoccupation. We're there to do positive things who need our help, and we only do them by winning elections. And since I repeat, I thought Jeremy could not under any circumstances win an election, I express my regret about his promotion. Well, I suppose with Oliver Cromwell, I have to consider the possibility that I might be wrong. It is just possible that Jeremy might win. And I excuse my mistake of 4 years ago by saying I had no way of knowing, nobody had any possible way of knowing, that the Tory party would behave in the way it behaved over the last 3 years. No party has behaved so incompetently in my experience. No party has thrown away its support so avidly. And the Tory party that used to say itself was the great election-winning machine of Europe has behaved in a way which seems to make sure that it could not win again. But then it also emphasises the weakness of the Labour Party. With the Tory party behaving in this self-destructive way, we managed to be 2% ahead on the opinion polls, when it should have been 40% ahead on the opinion polls. And therefore, my concern about the Labour Party winning developed over the last 2 years into a more intensive form than when I first felt it. So I want to talk about 3 of the consequences of Jeremy being leader before I talk about the long-term view of how the party should stand. And there are 3 problems, I think. The first was the anti-Semitism within the party. The second was the reappearance of the infiltrators who did us so much damage in the 70s and 80s. And the third was our position of the European Union. First of all, anti-Semitism. I think we have managed to dispose ourselves of that ghastly condition We didn't do it quickly enough, we didn't do it tough enough, we weren't positive enough in our determination to expunge all anti-Semitism from the party, but we've now done it. So we can write that one off, put that behind us. Infiltration into the party continues over the last year in very much the same way, in a minor form, to what it was in the 1970s and 80s. And nobody's doing very much about it. The infiltrators got an incentive to infiltrate, because thanks not so much to Jeremy Corbyn himself, but Corbynites, we're now in the party going through this ghastly process of reselecting members of Parliament. The reselection process is biased against sitting members, and the constituencies are suffused with enthusiasm for removing good members of Parliament who should be allowed to stand without any trouble or hindrance. And nothing would do Jeremy Corbyn and the party more good than if Jeremy was to put his foot down and say, enough of this nonsense, good members of Parliament must be allowed to stand without having to fight their way back to the nomination. Well, that leaves the third issue, and that's Europe. I have to put my own position to you, first of all, so you know what my bias is. I believe that leaving the European Union is the greatest tragedy this country has faced in 500 years. Leaving without a deal makes it even worse, but leaving in itself is a catastrophe, and a catastrophe against which the Labour Party should have fought, and fought with courage and conviction. In fact, we better admit it, that one of the reasons that we lost, we being the pro-Remainers, one of the reasons that we lost the plebiscite, the referendum, was because the Labour Party didn't campaign hard enough amongst its members, which was because Jeremy had his own personal doubts about it. I better make clear how strong my feelings are. There are no circumstances in which I would ever vote for Britain leaving the European Union. I keep hearing on television that 17 million people voted to leave. If the entire British population had voted to leave, I would still have voted against it. I hold the view, became, in my boyhood, the way in which members of Parliament were expected to behave. This is speaking to his constituency in 1770. I hold it that you, as a representative, owe your constituency your judgment as well as your industry. And if you deny them your judgment, you're treating them in just the same way. And my judgment is, without any doubt or reservation, that the people I want to help most when I have joined the Labour Party, the submerged 10%, the least off 15%, are the people who are going to lose most by us leaving the European community. They're going to lose it because we're going to lose jobs. They're going to lose it because we're not going to grow at a speed we're able to spend the money on public expenditure that we need to spend for welfare and health. And let's be absolutely frank about it. When it happens, as I fear it is going to happen, it won't be the Prime Minister who suffers, it won't be me who suffers. It'll be the depressed 10 or 15% of the population, and the Labour Party should have said, we're in Europe on behalf of the disadvantaged and the dispossessed. And we should have said it even more strongly when we think about what Europe became. Oh, I was always in favour of Europe. I was in favour of it before the Treaty of Rome. I was in favour of the Treaty of Messina. But I know that very many Labour Party members had doubts about it until Jacques Delors became president and developed what he called the People's Europe. All those regulations which protect people at work, the regulations to protect mothers and protect the sick and the old. All those regulations which have become part of Britain's social fabric, but according to the Foreign Secretary, the new Foreign Secretary, are the sort of things we want to get rid of if we can get out of Europe. And it is an absolute and total tragedy that the Labour Party should be still doubtful about where it now stands. Which leads us to this morning's announcement, or last night's announcement. I am, with some radio this morning, supporting Jeremy. The things that leaders of the opposition are supposed to do are move votes of no confidence when they are appropriate. And I think he was absolutely right to do this, or announce he's doing it this weekend. And the other minor parties who feel they can't support him better face the fact that by not supporting him, they are supporting leaving the European Union without an agreement. And they not to put their pride in their pockets and forget their vanity and just stand with Corbyn on this one occasion to do all we can to prevent us from leaving without a deal. Now, that leaves very little more to be said about the present. But I want to return, if I may, to the second point I discussed a minute ago, the arguments within the party, the infiltration, and the feeling that the Labour Party still stands for divided loyalties and divided principles. That's partly because of the Parliamentary Labour Party. The Parliamentary Labour Party is these days composed of people of more talent than at any time I've known during the last 50 years. The young men and women who are on the Labour Party's benches in the House of Commons are uniquely talented. Indeed, there are enough people of ability and integrity and experience and courage to make up 2 or 3 shadow cabinets. Unfortunately, most of them are on the back benches, but they are there. And I'm lost in admiration for their abilities. Night after night, I put on Newsnight or Late Night or Channel 4 News, and some young woman who I've never heard of before in my life appears as a member of Parliament for some or other and speaks with great enthusiasm and great knowledge and great panache about a new subject. And it wasn't like that in 1964. In 1964, the backbenchers who appeared on television were 4. Walden, Williams, Richards, and Hattersley. And we were permutated over the weeks. We would be phoned at 3 o'clock in the afternoon by the BBC and say, we're having a programme about cod fisheries in Iceland. Would you like to come on? And I would say, certainly I'd like to come on. I would know nothing about it. I'd find out for 2 hours during the afternoon, and then I'd appear on television. These days, the people who actually appear for the Labour Party on television know what they're talking about. They are immensely talented, and I'm full of admiration for them. Apart from one thing, they're immensely unpolitical. They know about the subject of government they want to talk about and want to advocate, but they don't talk about what the party stands for, what their beliefs are, why they joined the party, what are the principles of the socialism for which they stand. And that is something we agonizingly miss. One of the reasons is the fuss in the constituencies which nobody's squashing is there aren't people going around the country now, as there were 20 years ago, saying there may be a lot of infiltration from strange members of parties which are not really Labour, people who are affiliated to organisations which are not really Labour, but the real Labour Party still exists, and please believe it and stand up for it. 20 years ago, John Smith, Donald Dewar and I spent most of our time going around the country saying the real Labour Party still exists, so don't leave us. It's not happening now, and it should be happening. Somebody should be doing exactly that. And Alistair Campbell was a great example which ought to move us all. A great example of how not to go about improving the Labour Party. And no good saying the Labour Party is no good, I'm leaving. You say the Labour Party needs improving, so I'm staying. And I'm staying to fight. And that's what Alistair should have done. And that's what we need more of, people talking about what the real Labour Party stands for and saying it's alive and well and one day will return to its prominence and domination of the party. Now, the only excuse for people, young people, the talented Parliamentary Labour Party or enthusiastic backbenchers of not doing that is why, when you say you should stand for what the Labour Party stands for, you'd articulate the philosophy of Labour, you'd show us what democratic socialism means. They say we're not sure what the Labour Party does stand for anymore. We're not sure where our boundaries lie. We're not sure where our ideological frontiers are. So how can we defend them when we don't know where they are? And that's why I think the time has come for us to start saying what the Labour Party stands for and the principles on which it's based. Now, let me make clear, I'm not suggesting for a minute that we want long lectures, even at the Edinburgh Festival, on political theory. I don't want the shadow Home Secretary to write for The Guardian on the difference principle and its application to the equality of opportunity. I don't want that sort of talk, but I want us to know what it is we believe in and have no doubts about where we stand. The Labour Party's got a bad history in terms of its beliefs and concepts. It's never liked ideas. Herbert Morrison, the deputy leader of the Labour Party longer than anybody else, was asked about these things and said, socialism is what the Labour Party happens to be doing at any one time, which seemed to me to be an inadequate definition of the term. And the 20s and 30s and into the 40s, it was always a view in the Labour Party that ideas, political ideas, would get in the way of getting on with things. Heavens above, you don't need a theory for cleaning the slums. Heavens above, you don't need a theory for setting up a health service. Heavens above, you don't need a theory to demonstrate the need to get pensioners a living wage. It's obvious to everybody. And so it was in the 20s and 30s and perhaps in the 40s. But it isn't obvious to everybody anymore. The poverty's still there. I mean, it's hardly believable that 14 million people in Great Britain are living in poverty, that 4 million are living in destitution, that 8 million children are living in poverty. It's hardly believable that the differences in life opportunities are so still great in Britain. There's things in the paper today about life opportunities in Scotland, but I was going to tell you about my hometown of Sheffield. The ward in which I used to live in Sheffield, the expectation of a woman's healthy life, not a life and death, but a healthy life, she's expected to remain healthy till she's 70 in the ward in which I used to live. The ward I used to represent, a woman is expected to remain healthy till she's 50 or 55. These great discrepancies still prejudice life in our society, still make us feel that we're an equal society, still make us feel the battle has to be fought. But as I say, they're not as obvious as they were in the 20s and 30s, and we have to therefore justify our great campaign against them by saying there is this body of belief which supports us in all that we do. And the body of belief is what it always was and always will be: we have to be the party of equality. Now, being the party of equality opens us up to all sorts of criticisms, particularly from our Tory opponents, who often accuse us of being too theoretical and not sufficiently practical. There's an immense paradox here, because the real ideological party is the Tories. I mean, the Tories base their entire life on the false assumption that competition, the market, makes all things just and good. Not only does competition allocate resources in the economy in the most efficient way, it's the fairest way of allocating resources. Indeed, if you try to interfere with the market, stop a man or woman earning every penny that they can, take it away from them taxes, it's slavery. And Mrs. Thatcher actually believed in the concept of serfdom, the idea that we would become a nation of serfs as if we got to a point where a high percentage of our income was taken for public services. Yet they accuse us of being the people who are ideologically biased. The ideological belief can be a great assistant to parties in trouble. I remember the debate on the Western helicopters, the day that Michael Heseltine flounced out of the cabinet. And Mrs. Thatcher came to the House of Commons that day, as she said in her memoirs afterwards, not sure she'd be Prime Minister by 10 o'clock that night. And she made a speech, which was hardly about Western helicopters at all. It was about the importance of competition, the idea that the market was the best way of allocating resources, the idea that it was a moral way as well as the economic way. And the Tory party listened to her preaching this sermon and flocked behind her without worrying a damn about whether we should buy Western helicopters or not. The ideas that motivate a politician ought to be there to support them in times of good and bad and make them feel they want to move forward continually without any reservations. Our position must be, our position in the Labour Party, that we are the party of equality. And that means we have to be with Tory, with Green, with Crossland, and with the more modern philosophers of equality, and we have to say that is where we stand. Now, I talked a minute ago about what people thought about the Labour Party. And if people think about the Labour Party having any ideology at all, they think of us as the public ownership party, the nationalisation party. Now, I think we've got ourselves into confusions over nationalisation for far too long. I hold the Tory view that the decisions on nationalisation ought not be taken by what he called resounding declarations of the merits of private enterprise or public ownership, but according to the merits of the situation, industry by industry, company by company. And that means, from my point of view, that here I am on the right wing of the Labour Party, as I was always accused of being, always regarded as quasi-liberal, perhaps even quasi-Tory. I would probably take into public ownership more than most Labour Party members who've ever been near the leadership or deputy leadership. But I do it on the basis of the merits of a case rather than a general principle. Let me take you an example. I supported Tony Blair when he changed Clause 4 of the Constitution to something more up to date. You remember Clause 4 talked about the common ownership of the means of production, distribution and exchange. It is a line out of Marx's Capital, one of the few Marxist elements of the Labour Party. I keep being told that Jeremy Corbyn is a Marxist. I don't think he'd recognise Karl Marx if he joined the Islington Labour Club. But there is this one phrase that appears in the Labour Party's history, the common ownership of the means of production, distribution and exchange. And I was perfectly happy to see that removed from the clause, from the Constitution as a demonstration that we were modernising our philosophy. I wish it had been replaced by something that was written in English and was understandable, but I was happy to see that clause go. But I was deeply unhappy when we took it so much for granted that we began to privatise industries which clearly were best in public ownership. The obvious example is air traffic control. Why on earth we privatise air traffic control, I cannot imagine, because any criteria you set down for public ownership would include them remaining in the public sector. And the first thing we have to do is get our position clear on public ownership, which is, as I say and I repeat, the merits of the individual industry rather than some general principle it's good or bad one way or the other. And then we want to think of something which is more noble, more exciting, more concerned with principle than public ownership, which is a means of bringing about a change in society, not a change in itself. We need to believe in something which inspires, which moves people to tears if necessary, laughter to support. And that thing is a modern concept of equality. Now, the Tories always say that by pursuing equality, we are the party which limits freedom and liberty. That by pursuing equality, we want to impress our views on the entire society and make them all universal, make them all in the same mold, make them all similarly mediocre. But that's only if you define equality in the way that they choose to define it. Equality ought to be the gospel of freedom. And let me explain why. Freedom isn't the right to do things, it's the ability to do things. It's no good being free to do something if you can't afford to do it. A great example is always Bernard Shaw. And Bernard Shaw, in the great arguments in the first meeting of the Independent Labour Party, a great conversation with other Labour Party notables, which is written down by him verbatim and available in his biographies. Large metaphors about making pies, whether you collected the plums first and made the pies, or made the pears first and collected the plums afterwards. But the idea is there first established that freedom is the ability to do things as distinct from the right to do things. It's no good being told you can do something if you can't afford to do it. And as Bernard Shaw put it, we're a free country because everybody who wants to can eat tea in the Ritz as long as they can afford to pay for tea in the Ritz. And this applies to things much more important than tea in the Ritz. It applies to the great opportunities in society to do what we need to do and are entitled to do because we're free men and free women. Let me put it this way. There was a millionaire called Ronson, a rather nice man, I rather like him, who made some terrible financial mistake and went to prison for, I'm not sure how long, but as he went to prison, he was interviewed by some local radio person. And I hope there's nobody from local radio here, because I want to say this person asked him the sort of question that local radio would ask, which was, are you a millionaire, Mr. Ronson? And he said, yes, he was a millionaire. And she, for it was a she, then said, do you like being a millionaire? And he said, yes, he liked it very much. And she said, why do you like being a millionaire? And he said, because I can do what I like to do. If I want to go to work, I go to work. If I want to go on holiday, I get my airplane out and go on holiday. If I want to send my daughters away for education in France and Italy, I can do it. My money makes me free. Now, that is true. His money makes him free. But think how much better it would be if some of his money was used to making another 100, 150, 200, 500 pensioners free. Not free to go on holiday when they choose, not free to go to work if they don't want to, but free to buy a new coat or pay for fuel or go to visit their children 2 miles away. By spreading his money about, we make people more free. The sum of freedom is increased. And that makes us the Freedom Party. And that is a noble thing to be, and something we ought to be proud about being. Something that inspires, something that you die and live for, not something that's unimaginative and unromantic and unattractive and unidealistic as whether a company is in public or private ownership. Now, as I say, there are other complications. Liberties collide. If we're going to make freedom the watchword of the country, we have to think of what happens when two freedoms are in opposition to each other. John Rawls, the modern philosopher of freedom, talked about freedom colliding as in the means of a debating society. A debating society in which everyone's allowed to speak for as long as they want. But some people want to speak so long that they have their freedom, but the others can't get in a word edgeways, so they don't have any freedom at all. But the government then has to intervene to decide what you do when freedom collides. And government also has to intervene to decide what you do when freedom is going too far. Something that John Rawls called the difference principle. The example he and others give is a true example from the Soviet Union 100 years ago, nearly 100 years ago, 1925, when then an unknown man called Brezhnev wrote in Pravda that we're not going to any longer have needles and shoes made by communes. They're going to be made by private individuals as it was the old days, in the Tsarist days. Because we made them at the province of communal enterprise. Because it seemed to us wrong that some people had 5 pairs of shoes and other people only 1 pair of shoes. And through the communes, we were going to make sure that everybody has 2 pairs of shoes. However, we found out that many of the people say having 2 pairs of shoes is fine, but if they don't fit and they don't let in the water, we'd rather just have 1 pair of shoes. And the point when you take the pursuit of equality to a level in which it is working against the interests of people rather than in their favor. But all these things ought to be encompassed in the Labour Party saying what it is we believe in, and what we believe in is freedom and liberty that comes from equality. Now, as I say, the party is traditionally antagonistic to discussing ideas. Dick Crossman, writing in 1951, said that we lost our way not because we had no maps of the country we were to travel, but because we believed that experienced travelers didn't need maps at all. And that is part of the Labour Party's problem. We know about it without thinking about it. But I can repeat that we have to, when we pick ourselves up and prepare ourselves to go forward, start talking about principles and ideas and something which is worth fighting for and worth living for. I want politics to be exciting. I want it to be a great moral issue. I joined the Labour Party because I wanted to do something about poverty. I joined the Labour Party before I knew quite what the Labour Party stood for, because I was in the Labour Party family. But the progression was clear. When I was 11, I was taken to deliver leaflets in the 1945 general election. 11 plus examination, free in the afternoon. Thought I'd play cricket on Worsley Common. Taken up by my mother to put leaflets through doors. And I've been pushing leaflets through doors more or less ever since. And it was not until I was 18 that I read Tawney's Equality, when it totally and completely changed my life. Having read Equality, I knew that was it. I knew that's what mattered. I knew that's why I was in the Labour Party. I knew that's what I wanted to fight and live for. And the Labour Party should be saying the same thing, because we need to have this spirit. I shouldn't use the word because I used to represent a constituency with 40,000 Muslims, but we want a crusade that said we can build a better society, a society which is more equal and more free, and freedom and equality go hand in hand. Now, that may not happen for a year or two. It may not happen in my lifetime. But we're not going to speculate, even when we have questions and discussion afterwards, about the political demise of Jeremy Corbyn. Because he's the leader, he's going to remain the leader, and it's self-indulgence to talk about removing him. It's self-indulgence on the part of people who don't know quite what their body ought to do and find talking about removing Jeremy as an alternative to serious thought. Now, the serious thought about which we have to concentrate our minds is making clear what it is the Labour Party stands for. So when I next talk to people on the buses or on a train or in the street, they don't say to me, but what is it the Labour Party is about? The answer is we're about creating a more equal society. And what's more, it's a more equal society that benefits everybody, the rich as well as the poor. Because what we know for certain now is what we always wanted to believe but didn't have any evidence to prove, is that the benefits of equality apply from top to bottom of the income scale. If you read a book called The Spirit Level, it's an analysis of the social diseases that inflict themselves on and affect modern societies. Unwanted teenage pregnancies, knife crimes in the streets, drug addiction amongst young people. All those social diseases that we now regard as the main problem facing Western society. And what the Spirit Level demonstrates by hard analysis and careful statistics is the more equal society, the less the social diseases that impinge on its citizens. Because it's clear that the knife crime at one extreme, unwanted pregnancy at the other, comes about more often, as statistics demonstrate, from the underprivileged and the dispossessed. And the fewer underprivileged and dispossessed in society, the more civilized society is, and the more it benefits everybody. And that's what we have to say in the Labour Party. The Labour Party has not to descend into arguments about 2% of gross domestic product. We need to know about them and argue about them when it can, but it needs to be a great ideal and a great principle. And that will happen sooner or later. The only thing is later it happens, the more people are disadvantaged while we fail in our great destiny. I've never doubted for a minute that the Labour Party has this great destiny to change society, and it's a great privilege to disseminate the idea to you today. And I'll try to do so in the answering questions and discussion now that I've finished. Thank you very much indeed. Now, sitting down has caused the director a great deal of pleasure, because it was very clear to me as he was organising a talk that he didn't want his tenure as director to be marred by one of his participants dying on the stage. But here I am sitting down well and happy and ready to take questions and make comments. The gentleman there with the hand up right ahead. I don't think you'll get... Yes, little lady? Anyway, just there.
Thank you, Mr. Hattersley, for your long service and your eloquent discourse this afternoon. Could you describe, in terms of Scotland, the difference between the two parties in your mind, SNP and Labour, when, as you say, Labour stands for freedom and equality, as does the SNP? And do you see them moving closer together in the future in Scotland? Thank you.
Well, first of all, let me answer the implied question, which you're too courteous to put in terms. I'm against Scotland leaving the United Kingdom. Now, because I want to be honest with you, I have to say I'm not sure that would be my position if I was a Scotsman. But as an Englishman, I want to keep the Union. But I've no doubt at all that part of the strength of the SNP is its radical domestic programme. Indeed, part of the reason it's done so well over the last 10 years is it's filled the radical vacuum which was left by the Labour Party in Scotland. I was not a Blairite. I'm going to admire personally of Tony Blair, who I think is a man of very great ability. He worked for me for 5 years and was wonderful. But Blairism doesn't appeal to me as a political philosophy. I might say, I can't resist going down byways, I might say one of Tony's great friends was saying to me that I had misjudged him over the question of equality. He said, Tony believes in equality, he just doesn't believe in redistribution. But anyway, the years of Blairism, which looking back seem better now than they did then. And if you put Iraq aside, which is a big put aside, but if you put aside, is not a bad period of government to boast about. But one of the reasons that the SNP did so well during those years is the radical impulse which the Labour Party should have provided for Scotland wasn't there, and the SNP provided it in its place, or appeared to. So there is this common position between them. And I see that the SNP, unlike the Liberals, had the common sense today to say they'd talk to Jeremy about whether they can form a temporary alliance, a brief alliance, and to try and hold back leaving the Union without a deal. But I don't regard it as two parties which can come together in any formal sense, because Labour is a United Kingdom party, and the SNP is quite the opposite of that. But you'll see I'm not an unequivocal critic of the SNP. I admire some of their radicalism, though I sometimes feel that it's slightly bogus quality when they do things which are likely to benefit the rich rather than the poor, but still talk as if they were doing the opposite. Who's the next question? The lady down here, I think.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask, for those of us who are Labour Party members are seriously looking at whether there's any future for the Labour Party and who might look at a post-Brexit, might look at the SNP for the radical reasons you said. If we're to look at how we can see a light at the end of the tunnel, who is it that's going to lead that for the Labour Party nationally? Because there's no obvious candidate. In the next couple of years, there's no obvious candidate. Do you have a view of that?
The last sentence again. You're there.
The last bit was, if we're to stay with the Labour Party, to go towards the vision that you have, who is going to lead that nationally within the Labour Party? If it's not Germany, who is the obvious candidate within the current Labour Party?
Well, I'm very reluctant to nominate somebody and then find the curse of Hattersley is upon them. Also, I made a good joke on television with a lady called Stella Creasy, who was very, very talented. And I said we could have Stella Creasy as leader because she's got a great slogan, straighten things out with Creasy. She took terrible objection to me laughing about her name. So I'm cautious about what I should. But I can tell you 2 or 3 people. I mean, I voted for Yvette Cooper, the leader last time, and I'm glad to see Yvette Cooper leader again. I'm glad to see a leader I'm glad to vote for again. I think Hilary Benn is extremely good. I think there's 4 or 5 people who could be Labour Party leaders with distinction. I think the present Shadow Chancellor, who has some views that don't coincide with mine, would be a very competent leader and shows every signs of wanting to win the next election. And one of my reservations about Jeremy is he does things that may lead you to believe he doesn't want to win the next election, when the Shadow Chancellor does quite the opposite and quite the most positive things. But let me leave it where I started, which is the idea that there are so many good people in the parliamentary party that as long as we can liberate them from 2 things. One is this terrible pursuit by the infiltrators, and the other is the idea that we have to be technical rather than political and philosophic. They would make ideal prime ministers, and I hope I can live to see one of them do it. I'm told, next question, please. Let's say the hand up there, which I think is a lady's hand.
No, it's a man, actually.
Well, we all make mistakes.
Yeah. You've mentioned merit and equality a lot, but would society be in a better place to have made a better decision at the referendum and in all other decisions like elections and so on if the Labour Party had taken the opportunity when in power, all too infrequently unfortunately, to abolish the public school system and create a good, universal, comprehensive system of education?
Well, you'll forgive me, it's an old man's failing for reminiscing, but when Mrs. Thatcher was Education Secretary, I was her shadow. And one day during that time, I spoke to the Association of Private Primary Schools and said to them at the end of my speech, have no doubt of the Labour Party's intention initially to reduce and eventually to abolish fee-paying education in this country. And the next day there was nothing in the newspapers, mostly because Harold Wilson had been pulled into the sea by his dog on the channel. But 2 days later, the newspapers were full of Labour to abolish public schools. And I went on being Shadow Education Secretary until the general election, at which time I wasn't. And wasn't appointed Education Secretary, wasn't appointed in the Cabinet at all. One of the few examples of Shadow Cabinet members not getting the normal uplift into the real thing that there is in the history of the party. And after about 10 days, when I hadn't been appointed to anything, I got a message, would I go and see Harold Wilson? And I went to see him, and he went through his acts. We've been looking for you, we're trying to find you for the last week, where have you been? I'd been listening on the telephone for him to phone me. Do you want to join this government, do you not? Yes, I do want to join this government. Well, you could be number 2 at the Foreign Office and have our relationship with Europe, which was a great relief to me. And he said, you wonder why you're not doing education. And I said, well, I would like to do education. He said, we couldn't trust you. We wanted somebody we could trust. So we appointed Reg Prentice. This is so it only has meaning to people who realise that Reg Prentice left the Labour Party and joined the Tories. So I can boast on my CV that I am a martyr to private education. I am absolutely devoted to the notion of public education and private education being the thing that we want to diminish and get rid of. The European Union won't let us abolish private schools, but we can make it more difficult for them. It is in fact preposterous that they should have certain concessions, like no taxes on much of their income because they're charities. The idea that Eden is a charity is ridiculous. So I would do all those things to abolish them, not to abolish them, but to reduce them as much as we can. And I am an unequivocal supporter of genuine comprehensive schools. And by genuine comprehensive schools, I mean schools which take children of all abilities, probably teach them in sets rather than teach them in grades, and do as much as possible to make the school uniquely similar rather than having distinction within it. So my answer to your question is yes. And I think the next Labour government, even the one that we might just possibly get elected in 6 months' time or a year's time, would be far more positive about comprehensive education than its predecessor. But I'm with you all the way. Nothing could so change society than changing the nature of our divisive education system. And this I might say, I don't know what happened in Scotland, but in England we can't afford to have the other sort of schools, which are academies promoted by private individuals and private companies. Because whilst grammar schools produce a hierarchy of apparent ability, the academies produce a hierarchy of apparent excellence. So people are still saying he's not at a very good school, it's not an academy. And academies are doing damage to the nearby comprehensive schools. So I'm with you all the way. I am a thorough and absolute and extreme believer in comprehensive education. And nothing could do more to rebuild society in the way I want than making it work for Great Britain as a whole. There's an arm across here, the sector which I'm not going to try and...
Right, I went to Chris Mullin's event yesterday, and he said that Labour is notoriously reluctant at getting rid of bad leaders. And I don't think he meant solely the leader of the party, but I think that also reflected his views on leaders of some authorities. What is your kind of opinion on that?
Incidentally, this is a very disconcerting way of organizing questions, because whoever speaks to me, she or he comes from across there. So, well, I think we're not bad at getting rid of national leaders. We've never really got rid of one. Harold Wilson, the only those I know, Harold wanted to go 3 months before he left, but had to put it off because of the dockers' strike, and he couldn't in the middle of the strike, but he went of his own accord. Jim Callaghan went when he lost the election. Michael Foot went when he wanted to retire. We are not good at, and normally don't need to, get rid of national leaders. Of local authority leaders, I just don't know. My own hometown of Sheffield, we had very distinguished leaders, and got a very good leader now. We've had a lot of women leaders. Birmingham, well, not quite so good, but I think whoever said that was wrong. I think we've done pretty well about local authority leaders and pretty well about Labour Party leaders. There have been some notable occasions when the wrong candidate was elected for leader. The one I'm thinking of was when Neil beat me. Though actually, let me say this quite seriously. I now believe that Neil was the right man to lead the Labour Party at that time, because Neil, in 4 years, transformed the Labour Party into a moderate, sensible, practical, down-to-earth election-winning party. If I tried to do the same, they would have said that rotten right-winger is trying to make us into Tories. But Neil did exactly the things I would have done and couldn't get away with it. So he was right to make him leader, and he did it properly and did it well. So I think, by and large, we are okay about leaders. And there have been some mistakes, but by and large, we're okay. Next one. Now, there's an arm up there again. I won't try and judge the sex of it.
Well, hopefully my voice is deep enough for you. I came out of a council house in Lithgow, and Tamdale was our MP. My father was the rent man, before that was a joiner, and I got to university, and that was all through, it didn't matter really if it was a Labour or a Tory government. You talk about education, and education in these days was a good, solid education. And I'm just wondering if you think that Labour and possibly the Tories, and by the way, I went to university with a lot of private school boys. Do you think that Labour has been instrumental in dumbing down education and standing back as well and letting the SNP make it a lot worse in the last 12 years, to the point where the numeracy rate and literacy rate in this country is diabolical.
Well, I wouldn't presume to comment on the literacy rate in Scotland. It's not diabolical in England. There's been some marginal improvements. And I don't think education has dumbed down. I read in newspapers that universities are now giving degrees in classes that wouldn't have been given in my day, that really all those of us who've got second should have got first. I'm open to that argument. But I don't believe there's been a general dumbing down. What there has been an extension. And the things which happen now happened 50 years ago, but we didn't notice about it. We didn't notice because so many children were written off in this old-fashioned secondary modern schools. We didn't notice whether they were doing well or doing badly. We just worried about the 12% or 15% who went into secondary grammar school. I'm skeptical about the idea of dumbing down. I think it's what old men say, but this old man doesn't agree with it. All the evidence in England, and I can't speak for Scotland, is that the education system is gradually and marginally improving. And the real problems for education in England is in the inner cities where there are schools which are almost entirely composed of children from disadvantaged families. And if we can do away with the disadvantage, the education will follow behind. The two things go together side by side, and that is much more important than thinking that education itself is failing. Gentleman right here in front.
I was brought up in Liverpool, a reasonably comfortable home, but I saw poverty. And one thing that staggered me was the number of people who voted Tory in this city of a lot of desperation. I don't understand it. Do you have any idea why people are not turkeys, they're not smart enough, and they vote for Christmas?
Yes. I was reading the other night, Nye Bevan speaking at his last Labour Party conference in 1959. I was a member of Parliament, he said, when there were 3 million unemployed in this country, and we still didn't have a Labour government. This is Nye Bevan. Half of the unemployed voted Tory. This is in the 1930s. And the same question arose when I was Shadow Education Secretary about why is it that people whose sons and daughters haven't the hope in hell of going to a grammar school still vote to keep grammar schools even though they're going to be to their disadvantage. And I think there's two answers or three answers. One is the English. I'm not sure about the Scots, but the English are by their nature deferential people. They are conscious of their elders and betters and sometimes want to do things which promote the interests of their elders and betters rather than themselves. Secondly, they like the idea of there being a chance of it. Okay, I say when we go to try and have a comprehensive campaign in the town of Richmond in Yorkshire, you have one chance in 10 of your child going to a grammar school. You have 9 chances out of 10 of it going to an inadequate secondary modern school. No, but we like the prospect, the chance, we like the hope, we like the theory that we might just possibly do it. And I think that applies to all sorts of other things. We may never make a fortune, but we want the chance to make a fortune being theoretically available to us, even though in reality it won't. And there's the great tawny image of the frog and tadpoles. Had I known I was going to be asked this question, I would have brought to read it to because it's so better in his language. He talks about society being like a pond full of tadpoles. And 100 tadpoles, and we know by their nature only one of them will ever become a frog. But one gradually begins to develop frog characteristics. He's torn into the puffed out his chest. He's develops eyes, he develops legs, and he climbs onto a leaf floating in the middle of the pond and lectures the rest of the tadpoles how tadpoles of ability and determination and courage and character could, if they tried, become a frog like him. And there is that tadpole-frog situation amongst human beings. We may not be able to make it into the superior sort of animal, but we'd like the chance even if we were to fail. And we in the Labour Party have to move the British character out of that and say there should be something better that really happens rather than you hope to happen. But it is a characteristic failing which I think applies to all human beings. Now, unless my watch is wrong, it's almost 2:30, which means that I spoke to you for nearly 40 minutes, which I apologise. But we'll take 2 more questions and then I shall go away while somebody else comes here. Gentleman there. Yes, the microphone's coming to you, I hope.
Could you tell me,
We'll have the patient lady will be the next one.
okay, could you tell me why you think the Labour Party has sorted out its problem with anti-Semitism?
Well, I can't, is the answer to the question. I can give you some rough ideas, but they're very unconvincing. I was appalled to find that we had a problem. I mean, until the problem became public, I had not the faintest idea that the problem existed. I've never been in a Labour Party where there was the slightest touch of anti-Semitism, and I found it almost inconceivable that people who hold socialist views or claim to should also be anti-Semitic. My only marginal explanation and highly marginal excuse is a confusion in the public mind or in the Labour Party mind of Jews and the foreign policy of Israel. I am a strong supporter of Israel. I believe that Israel, the creation of the independent Jewish state of Israel, was one of the great heroic events of the 20th century. But I am a deep opponent of much of the Likud foreign policy on the West Bank and Gaza and all that. And I think there became a great confusion in the simple minds of some Labour Party people between what right-wing government in Israel was doing to its Arab minorities and Jews in Great Britain. But it's not an explanation, it's not even an excuse, it's just the nearest I can get to connecting the 2 things. The fact that it exists came as a surprise to me, came as a shock to me, came as a horror to me, and was made all more horror by the slowness with which we've tried to wipe it out and cleanse ourselves of it. I think we have done that now. We may have driven some of it underground, but it's not there in the way it was 6 months ago. And that is one thing we've cleared up. But I find it incomprehensible that it should be in the Labour Party. But then I find anti-Semitism incomprehensible wherever it may be. But fortunately, one of the things we can support and can rejoice about in the Labour Party over the last 6 months is that one error we have, I think, now corrected. And let's be glad that we're making just some progress on some things. One more. Gentleman there.
Yeah, well, thank you, Roy. The last 10 years in the House of Commons have been pretty much defined by coalitions, agreements. The last 9 years, 7 of them have had coalitions. Now, I'm rather sold on the idea, I've got to admit, but the current idea, what we have now, we have 2 taxi loads of Irish MPs accountable to 1 million people, basically calling the shots for 66 million people. A government should be accountable to the people it governs, and this one isn't. Is there any way at all it could be made doable or enforceable that coalitions are between only those parties which have a UK-wide accountability? There's lots of them. But could it be done?
I don't think it can be done. I'm going to say 2 quick things because the director reminded me the time is up, and we'll have 1 more question after this, and I'll answer this one very quickly. No, I can't have 1 more question. I just answer this one. At length. I think the appalling thing about the House of Commons over the last 5 years is that the entire policy of Her Majesty's government, and therefore the entire policy imposed on people of Britain, has been the policy of the rump of the right wing of the Tory party. The right wing of the Tory party has run the Tory party, and the Tory party has run the House of Commons. And that's because of the way the chips have fallen. I now, and this can only be my last sentence, am converted to proportional representation, not because I think it's a fairer system. Not because I think it's a fairer system, but because we know with proportional representation there would have to be a coalition. It would always bring coalitions to bout. And therefore, when you and I vote in the next general election, we know we were voting for a coalition, and we vote in that knowledge, which will produce much better support for ideals, much better principles, and much better government, with which I can only thank you. I've enjoyed myself enormously. I hope you found it tolerable. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Roy. Just stay there a second.
Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, I couldn't stop him, but we had to stop him. But I just want to acknowledge this man, his contribution to public life, not just over the 36 years of the Book Festival, but over 50 years of political and public life. An extraordinary contribution. I really want you to join me in thanking Roy Hattersley.
You help me down with that.
Wonderful, wonderful.